She doesn't belong here. The whispers followed her like shadows as she walked through the officer's mess, her uniform pristine, but somehow still out of place on her slender frame. Then the colonel saluted her secret tattoo, and everything changed. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel and comment where you're watching from. The morning frost clung stubbornly to the windows of the rehabilitation center, refusing to yield to spring's tentative arrival in the Carpathian foothills. Inside, the air hummed with nervous energy as orderlies and nurses hurried through their routines with extra precision. Colonel Andrei Salenko's inspection wasn't just routine. It determined funding, resources, and ultimately survival for many of the forgotten veterans who called this place home. Irina Mavros moved through the eastern corridor like a shadow, her footsteps barely audible against the worn linoleum. Unlike her colleagues who whispered anxiously about the impending visit, she maintained her customary silence, methodically folding each sheet into perfect hospital corners. Her weathered hands worked with mechanical efficiency, creating neat stacks that spoke of military precision rather than civilian caregiving. The colonel's vehicle just arrived, a young nurse announced breathlessly, causing a ripple of tension through the staff gathered in the main hall. Irina simply nodded, her eyes remaining fixed on her task. She had survived worse than military inspections. 20 years as an orderly had taught her invisibility was safety. Blend in, keep quiet, do your work. The veterans recognized something in her, though. The way they straightened slightly when she entered their rooms. The way they accepted her ministrations without complaint. Colonel Salenko strode through the entrance with the confidence of a man accustomed to command, flanked by two junior officers clutching clipboards. His gaze swept the assembled staff, cataloging deficiencies with practiced efficiency. Director Pavel Dragomir hovered nervously at his side, pointing out recent improvements to the facility. "And our staff retention is excellent," Dragomir was saying, gesturing toward the line of orderlies. "Many have been with us for—" The colonel's steps faltered as his eyes landed on Irina. His expression shifted from professional detachment to something sharper, more focused. "She doesn't belong here," Salenko stated flatly, his voice cutting through the hall's nervous murmurs. Every head turned toward Irina, who had frozen mid-fold. The accusation hung in the air, heavy and damning. Director Dragomir's face drained of color as he stammered for a response. Irina slowly set down her linens and turned to face the colonel, her expression carefully blank. As she moved, her sleeve rode up slightly, revealing the edge of a faded tattoo. An intricate wing design etched in black ink, nearly invisible against her olive skin. Colonel Salenko's eyes widened in recognition. The clipboard in his hand lowered slowly as his entire demeanor transformed. Without a word, he straightened his spine and raised his right hand in a formal military salute, a gesture of profound respect reserved for superior officers. The hall fell into stunned silence. Irina's eyes, usually downcast, met the colonel's with quiet intensity. She gave him the slightest nod before turning back to her linens, leaving everyone else frozen in confusion. The morning after Colonel Andrei Salenko's unexpected salute, the rehabilitation center buzzed with whispers. Veterans huddled in small groups during breakfast, their voices dropping whenever Irina Mavros passed by. The orderlies were no better, exchanging theories in hushed tones while distributing medications. "I heard she commanded special forces," muttered one elderly veteran to his tablemate. "Why else would a colonel show such respect to a cleaning woman?" "Perhaps she saved his life," another suggested, embellishing the tale with each retelling. "My cousin worked with Ghost Wing operatives in the 90s. They moved like shadows, left no trace." Irina kept her eyes down as she methodically distributed fresh linens, her movements economical and precise. Though her face remained impassive, her heart hammered against her ribs. The quiet life she had carefully constructed over years was unraveling with alarming speed. She could feel curious gazes following her through corridors, sense the speculation hanging in the air like the mountain mist that clung to the facility's windows. Director Pavel Dragomir observed the commotion from his office doorway, his expression unreadable. When their eyes briefly met across the dining hall, he quickly looked away, busying himself with paperwork. The director's avoidance spoke volumes. By midday, 3 different versions of the story circulated through the rehabilitation center. Some claimed Irina had been a decorated commander. Others whispered she was a spy who had infiltrated enemy territory. The non-verbal veteran in room 12 simply watched her with knowing eyes whenever she entered, tapping his arm where her tattoo would be. Colonel Salenko himself remained at the facility, extending his inspection by another day, an unprecedented deviation from protocol. The military man's behavior had subtly transformed. He no longer barked orders or scrutinized the center's operations with his usual severity. Instead, his attention frequently drifted to Irina as she went about her duties. "The files show you've worked here 4 years," he remarked when they crossed paths in an empty corridor. "Quite a change from your previous position." Irina nodded curtly and continued walking, but felt his concerned gaze following her retreat. Mirella, the young nurse with perpetually curious eyes, cornered Irina in the supply room that afternoon. "Everyone's talking about you," she said, leaning against the doorframe. "Who are you really?" "Just an orderly," Irina replied softly, arranging gauze pads with military precision. The nurse didn't look convinced. "Nobody is just anything in this place." That night, Irina checked the locks on her small room twice, then examined the emergency exit route out of habit. The rehabilitation center's insulated calm had shattered. Nothing felt safe anymore. Her past, which she had buried beneath years of silent service, was clawing its way to the surface, and she knew from experience that some ghosts, once awakened, refused to return to their graves. The chalk scraped against the floor tiles, creating that familiar, unsettling sound that had become the soundtrack to Irina Mavros's afternoons. The nonverbal veteran, a gaunt man with vacant eyes who had arrived 3 months earlier, sat cross-legged in the corner of the recreation room, hunched over his latest creation. His fingers moved with surprising precision for someone whose medical chart listed severe trauma-induced motor impairments. "Same thing again today?" Mirella asked, pausing beside Irina with a stack of fresh linens. Irina nodded, her eyes fixed on the man's methodical movements. Day after day, he drew the same symbol, wings spread in flight, intersected by a single vertical line. The ghost wing emblem. Her emblem. The mark hidden beneath her sleeve that Colonel Salenko had somehow recognized. "I'll clean it up before dinner," Irina said quietly, her voice barely audible above the ambient noise of the rehabilitation center. The veteran, whose name was redacted in his files, had never spoken a word since arriving at the facility. His only form of communication was through these chalk drawings, rendered with an obsessive attention to detail that suggested more than random fixation. The proportions were always exact, the angles precise. This wasn't the work of a broken mind. It was a message. When the recreation period ended, Irina knelt beside him with a damp cloth. The veteran didn't acknowledge her presence, but his hands stilled as she began wiping away his work. Their routine had become a silent ritual. He created, she erased, neither acknowledging what they both understood. Today, however, he grabbed her wrist as she reached for the drawing. His grip was surprisingly strong, his gaze suddenly focused. With his free hand, he tapped the emblem, then pointed directly at Irina's covered forearm where her own tattoo lay hidden. "I know," she whispered, glancing around to ensure they weren't observed, "but we can't talk about this here." The veteran released her, then used his chalk to scratch 3 quick lines beside the emblem. A code only Ghostwing operatives would recognize. Field coordinates, a location she knew all too well. Irina's heart pounded against her ribs. This man wasn't just drawing from fragmented memories or rumors. He knew, which meant he had been there, on that final mission when everything fell apart. when she had given the order that cost so many lives. She erased the drawing with trembling hands, wondering if he had been her spotter during that fateful operation. The timing matched his injuries. The way he watched her, with that mixture of reverence and accusation, suggested a shared history too painful to voice. As Irina stood to leave, the veteran began drawing again. The same emblem, the same message. Some ghosts, it seemed, refused to be erased, no matter how many times she wiped the slate clean. Mirella Novak had always been observant. 3 weeks into her nursing position at the rehabilitation center, she'd already memorized every patient's medication schedule, and which veterans preferred their coffee black versus with 2 sugars. But Irina Mavros remained an enigma that gnawed at her professional curiosity. The young nurse paused in the doorway of the supply room, watching as Irina meticulously folded linens. There was something almost military in her precision. Corners aligned with mathematical exactness, each fold executed with the same measured pressure. Not the random efficiency of someone who'd worked in healthcare for years, but something else entirely. "Need any help?" Mirella offered, stepping into the cramped space. The orderly barely acknowledged her presence with a slight nod, continuing her work without breaking rhythm. Up close, Mirella noticed calluses on Irina's hands that didn't match typical orderly work. These were older, deeper marks of someone who had handled equipment far heavier than bedpans and medical charts. "I can finish these if you want to start on the east wing," Mirella suggested, hoping to be left alone in the supply room. After Irina departed, Mirella quickly began restocking the shelves. As she reached for the bottom drawer of the metal cabinet, her fingers caught on something taped to its underside. Curious, she peeled away a folded paper, carefully concealed where inventory checks would never reveal it. The list contained 23 names, each followed by a location and date. Scanning the information, Mirella's pulse quickened. She recognized 3 names, veterans who had been transferred here after their previous facilities had mysteriously closed. The dates corresponded exactly with the shuttering of international clinics following funding cuts. Footsteps in the corridor sent her heart racing. Mirella hastily photographed the document with her smartphone before returning it precisely where she'd found it. That evening, in her modest apartment overlooking the mountain valley, the nurse researched each name on the list. Patterns emerged. All were veterans from classified operations. All had been relocated multiple times, and all had medical files with curious gaps in their histories. The following day, Mirella watched Irina with new eyes. The way she positioned herself in rooms, always with sightlines to exits, how she subtly assessed new visitors before anyone else noticed them, the precise manner she documented medication distributions, using a shorthand notation Mirella had never seen in medical training. Mirella began keeping a journal, documenting Irina's routines and peculiarities. She volunteered for extra shifts when the orderly was working. She listened more carefully to the whispers that followed Colonel Solenko's unusual salute. Something much larger than a rehabilitation center's daily operations was unfolding here. And somehow, the quiet woman who folded linens with military precision stood at its center. The third note arrived on Director Pavel Dragomir's desk before dawn, slipped under his door with the same chilling precision as the others. He unfolded it with a practiced calm that betrayed none of the turmoil beneath. Security protocol violation. Subject Mavros. Final warning. Remove immediately or face consequences. Pavel ran his thumb over the typewritten letters, feeling the slight indentations in the paper. No signature, no official letterhead, just like the others. He locked it in his desk drawer with its predecessors and straightened his tie, preparing for the confrontation he could no longer postpone. Irina Mavros was folding sheets in the East Wing when he found her. The orderly worked with methodical focus, her movements economical and precise. For a moment, Pavel simply watched her, struck by how the years had changed yet preserved her. The silence between them felt weighted with unspoken history. "My office," "Now," he said, his voice carrying the authority of his position, but lacking its usual edge. In the sterile confines of his office, Pavel stood behind his desk, a barrier between them that felt both necessary and insufficient. "There are concerns about your presence here," he began, shuffling papers unnecessarily. "Questions about your qualifications, your background checks." Irina stood perfectly still, her eyes fixed on a point just beyond his shoulder. "I have all the proper documentation," she replied, her voice quiet but firm. "Documentation can be questioned. Protocols can be reviewed." Pavel leaned forward. "Someone wants you gone, Mavros, and they're becoming insistent." A flicker of something, recognition, perhaps fear, crossed her face before disappearing behind her practiced mask. "Who?" she asked simply. "If I knew, we wouldn't be having this conversation." The director sighed, suddenly looking older than his years. "I'm giving you an official warning, for the record." Their eyes met, and in that moment, the bureaucratic pretense between them thinned. Pavel's gaze held old wounds, regrets, and something that might have been guilt. "We both know this isn't about paperwork," Irina said softly. Pavel looked away first. "The rehabilitation center has protocols. I'm merely enforcing them." "Of course, Director Dragomir." As she turned to leave, he called after her, his voice lower, almost personal. "Be careful, Irina. The mountains have long memories." She paused at the door, her back still to him. "So do I." After she left, Pavel opened his drawer and stared at the 3 threatening notes. His hand trembled slightly as he reached for the phone. Some ghosts couldn't remain buried forever, and he wondered which ones were coming back to haunt them now. The night air hung heavy with tension as screams echoed through the rehabilitation center's west wing. A veteran, one of the newer arrivals from the Sarajevo conflict, had spiraled into a violent flashback episode, overturning furniture and threatening anyone who approached with a makeshift weapon fashioned from a broken chair leg. Irina Mavros arrived before the security team, her footsteps barely audible on the linoleum floor. The orderly assessed the situation with a single sweeping glance, then raised her hand to halt the approaching staff members. "Give me space," she commanded, her usually silent demeanor replaced by quiet authority. Mirela watched from the doorway, transfixed, as Irina approached the panicking man using a peculiar sideways stance. The nurse had witnessed dozens of crisis interventions during her time at the center, but nothing like this. Irina wasn't following any protocol taught in their training manuals. "Your right flank is covered, soldier." Irina spoke in a rhythmic cadence, using terminology unfamiliar to standard medical practice. "Position secure. Breathe on my count. 4 in, 7 hold, 8 release." The veteran's eyes locked onto her, recognition flickering, not of her face, but of the pattern she was establishing. His grip on the improvised weapon loosened. "Ground position, horizon check, sound off," she continued, her hands moving in precise gestures that seemed to communicate more than her words. Mirela noticed a visiting monitor from the health ministry observing from the hallway, his expression darkening with suspicion as he scribbled notes onto his clipboard. These weren't standard de-escalation techniques. They were something else entirely. Within minutes, the veteran was seated calmly on the floor, the crisis diffused without medication or restraints. The other patients who had gathered at a safe distance exchanged knowing glances. Something had shifted in their perception of the quiet orderly. "Where did you learn that?" Mirela asked later, helping Irina restore order to the room. "Experience," came the terse reply as the older woman methodically straightened furniture, her movements economical and precise. "That wasn't standard training," Mirela persisted. "Those commands, that approach, I've never seen anything like it." Irina paused, her eyes briefly meeting the younger woman's. Some things aren't in manuals. In the days that followed, Mirela noticed subtle changes throughout the facility. Veterans began seeking out Irina during their difficult moments. They would sit near her during meals, their postures relaxing in her presence. Even the nonverbal patient seemed calmer when she was nearby. his chalk drawings becoming less frantic. The monitor's report cited unconventional methodology requiring further investigation. But even he couldn't deny the results. Something ancient and powerful lived in Irena's techniques. Something that spoke directly to broken soldiers in a language only they understood. For Morella, the mystery deepened. What she had witnessed wasn't just skill. It was evidence of a shared history, a secret language between warriors. And she was now more determined than ever to uncover the truth behind the Ghost Wing. The rehabilitation center's morning routine was interrupted by the arrival of a sleek black vehicle that pulled into the gravel driveway. Doru Vlasanu stepped out, straightening his leather jacket and adjusting the messenger bag that concealed his tape recorder. The journalist had spent 3 weeks securing this visit, claiming to be investigating reports of understaffing and resource mismanagement. Director Pavel Dragomir greeted him in the main hall with a practiced smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Our facility has nothing to hide, Mr. Vlasianu, though I must insist patient privacy remains paramount." Doru nodded politely while scanning the corridor, his trained eye noting security camera positions and staff movements. "Of course, Director, I'm only interested in operational concerns, not individual cases." The tour proceeded with calculated precision. Pavel introduced various staff members, all seemingly rehearsed in their responses about funding challenges and administrative hurdles. But Doru's attention kept drifting to the orderly working silently at the far end of the East Wing, Irena Mavros, the woman whose name had appeared in his father's final letter before disappearing 15 years ago. "Who's that?" Doru asked casually, pointing toward Irena. "Just maintenance staff," Pavel replied too quickly. Now, regarding our rehabilitation protocols, during lunch, Doru excused himself to use the restroom, but instead slipped down an empty corridor toward the restricted wards. He had nearly reached the security door when a voice behind him made him freeze. "Visitors aren't permitted beyond this point." He turned to find Irena standing there, her posture deceptively relaxed, but her eyes alert with the watchfulness of someone accustomed to threat assessment. "I got lost," Doru offered with an apologetic smile. "The restrooms are in the opposite direction," she replied, her voice carrying the slight hoarseness of someone unaccustomed to regular speech. Later that afternoon, while interviewing a physical therapist, Doru noticed Irena methodically folding linens in the adjacent room, positioned perfectly to overhear every question. When he subtly mentioned special operations veterans, her hands paused for just a fraction of a second, a tell that confirmed his suspicions. That evening, as staff prepared dinner, Doru made another attempt to access patient records, only to find Irena already there, organizing supplies that shouldn't have needed attention. "You're very dedicated to your work," he remarked. The orderly met his gaze with unflinching steadiness. "Some duties continue long after official service ends." The statement hit Doru like a physical blow. Those were nearly the exact words from his father's letter. As he left that night, Doru knew with certainty. This silent woman with watchful eyes held the truth about Ghostwing and his father's fate. And somehow, she had been expecting him. The storage room had been slated for cleaning since winter, but only now, with spring's thaw, did anyone have time for the task. Morella pushed aside dusty boxes, her hands working methodically through forgotten items. Most lockers had been emptied years ago, but one remained locked, its combination lost to time. "This one's jammed," she called to no one in particular, before noticing a small gap where the metal had warped. Curiosity got the better of her. With a borrowed screwdriver, she pried at the weakened spot until the locker surrendered with a metallic groan. Inside lay an old prosthetic leg, military-grade but outdated by at least a decade. Morella lifted it, surprised by its lightness. Something rattled within. The nurse examined it closer, finding a hidden compartment in the hollow calf section. Her fingers trembled as she extracted a ceremonial medal, its surface still gleaming despite years of confinement. The inscription caught her breath. "For extraordinary valor beyond duty, Irena Mavros, Operation Blackwater. Operation Blackwater? Mirella whispered, running her thumb over the engraving. No such operation existed in any public record she knew of. The medal was official, bearing military insignia and proper authentication marks. Yet its very existence contradicted everything she understood about the quiet orderly. Mirella sat back on her heels, mind racing. The prosthetic suggested an injury severe enough to require amputation. Yet Irina walked without any visible impairment. Had she recovered somehow? Or was the prosthetic meant for someone else, someone connected to her mysterious past? The young nurse slipped the medal into her pocket, replacing the prosthetic exactly as she'd found it. She closed the locker door, securing it with a new padlock from maintenance supplies. That evening, she observed Irina more carefully. The orderly moved with her usual efficiency, folding linens with that strange, precise pattern. Nothing in her gait suggested a previous amputation. Yet when Irina reached high to replace a supply box, Mirella noticed a slight wince, the kind that comes from old wounds remembering themselves. "Need help with that?" Mirella offered, stepping forward. Irina shook her head, lowering her arms carefully. "I've managed worse." The casual comment hung between them, loaded with unspoken history. Mirella fingered the medal in her pocket, wondering what worse might encompass for someone decorated for valor in a mission that officially never happened. Why would someone hide their own commendation? What shame or danger could be attached to recognition of courage? The questions multiplied, each more troubling than the last. The rehabilitation center's walls suddenly seemed thinner, its foundations less stable. The past wasn't just recorded in files and photographs. It was embedded in the building itself, hidden in abandoned lockers and carried in the bodies of those who walked its halls. Especially Irina Mavros, whose secrets were beginning to surface despite her careful silence. The supply closet door creaked as Mirella slipped inside, her heart pounding against her ribs. 3 nights of searching had yielded nothing but dust and disappointment. But tonight felt different. She ran her fingers along the spine of an ancient supply ledger, its cover worn smooth by years of handling. When she pulled it from the shelf, something fluttered to the floor, an aged photograph, its corners yellowed and curling. Mirella's breath caught as she held it under her small flashlight. There stood Irina Mavros, decades younger but unmistakable, clad in a military uniform unlike any Mirella had seen in Romanian archives. The insignia on her shoulder, the ghost wing emblem, matched exactly what the nonverbal patient drew obsessively on the floor. Irina's eyes in the photo were hard, determined, steeled for whatever war awaited her. But what made Mirella's skin prickle was what surrounded Irina. 6 other soldiers stood beside her, but where their faces should have been were only jagged scratches in the photograph's surface. Someone had methodically, violently erased every identity except Irina's. "What happened to you all?" Mirella whispered, tracing the scratched surfaces with her fingertip. The young nurse slid to the floor, back against the supply shelves, mind racing. This wasn't just evidence of military service. This was something else entirely. The ghost wing wasn't merely a unit. From everything she'd gathered, it was something governments preferred to forget. And Irina hadn't been just any medic. The stance, the insignia placement, the way others positioned around her. She had been in command. Mirella tucked the photograph into her pocket, replaced the ledger, and moved toward the door. A shadow passed in the hallway, freezing her in place. She extinguished her light, waiting until footsteps faded before slipping out. The next morning, Mirella watched Irina with new eyes as the orderly methodically folded linens, her movements precise and economical. No wasted motion, no unnecessary steps. Not the habits of someone who had always been changing bedsheets, but of someone trained to maximize efficiency in life-or-death situations. Admiration bloomed in Mirella's chest. This woman had led soldiers, had likely saved countless lives, yet confusion clouded her thoughts. Why was a decorated commander working as an orderly? What had happened to those scratched-out faces? And why did Colonel Solenko's salute seem to terrify rather than honor her? Irena looked up suddenly, catching Morella's stare. Something flashed in the older woman's eyes, recognition perhaps, or warning, before she returned to her work, shoulders slightly more tense than before. The young nurse turned away, the photograph burning in her pocket like a live coal. The truth about Ghostwing was within reach, but Morella was beginning to wonder if uncovering it might put them all in danger. Director Pavel Dragomir slammed the phone down, his face ashen. The rehabilitation center's primary donor had delivered an ultimatum: remove Irena Mavros from the staff, or lose all financial support. Word of her Ghostwing past had traveled faster than anyone anticipated. "They're giving us 48 hours, Pavel muttered to his administrative assistant. He ran his fingers through his thinning hair, eyes darting toward the window where Irena could be seen helping a veteran navigate the garden path with his new prosthetic. By lunchtime, whispers filled every corridor. The center's cook reduced portion sizes without announcement, the first silent acknowledgement of dwindling resources. Medical supplies were counted twice, then locked away with new vigilance. "We can't lose her," Morella insisted during an impromptu meeting in the supply closet. 5 staff members huddled around a flickering light bulb, their faces grim with determination. The veterans trust her. Captain Petrescu hasn't spoken to anyone else since his arrival. The group devised a rotation system. When officials or potential donors visited, Irena would be redirected to the basement archives or sent on fabricated errands to the village. The young nurse coordinated these movements with military precision, using hand signals developed specifically for this purpose. Colonel Solenko arrived unannounced that afternoon, ostensibly for inspection. The staff exchanged panicked glances as Irena rounded a corner directly in his path. "Orderly," he called loudly, then lowered his voice. "My office received the same threat. They're watching the center. Be careful." The veterans sensed the change. The nonverbal patient drew increasingly frantic wing symbols, smudging them violently when anyone but Irena approached. Others hoarded medication, preparing for abandonment they'd experienced before. Pavel found Irena folding linens that evening, her methodical movements encoding messages only Ghostwing operatives would understand. "You could transfer," he suggested weakly. "Another facility in Bucharest might—" "You know they don't want me transferred," she interrupted, her voice barely audible. "They want me gone, erased." That night, staff discovered the kitchen nearly empty. Someone had taken food supplies, not stolen, but hidden throughout the veterans' quarters. A silent rebellion against the coming storm. Irena stood at her window until dawn, watching the mountain mist curl around the facility's perimeter fence. Her options narrowed with each passing hour: leave and doom the center to systematic dismantling, or stay and fight against forces that had already erased Ghostwing from official records. Either way, the price would be measured in lives, the very lives she had sworn to protect. The weight of this choice pressed against her chest like a physical wound as the first light of morning crept across the Carpathian peaks. Captain Luca Petrescu arrived at the rehabilitation center on a Tuesday morning, his weathered face bearing the permanent marks of shrapnel from the Sarajevo siege. The staff wheeled him through the main corridor, his right leg heavily bandaged from a recent surgery to remove embedded metal fragments that had caused years of chronic pain. Irena Mavros was changing linens in the East Wing when Director Pavel Dragomir summoned her to assist with the new arrival's orientation. She entered the intake room with her usual quiet efficiency, clipboard in hand, eyes downcast as she had trained herself to be over the years, invisible, forgettable. "Standard admission protocol," the director muttered before stepping out, leaving Irena alone with the captain. The moments stretched between them. Luca's breathing changed first, a sharp intake, followed by complete stillness. When Irena finally looked up, his eyes were wide with recognition. "Commander Mavros?" he whispered, his voice cracking with disbelief. "They told us you were dead." The orderly froze, her fingers tightening around the clipboard. "You're confused from the medication, Captain. I'm just staff here." "No," Luca struggled to sit upright. "Sarajevo, the Eastern Corridor extraction. 16 civilians and 4 wounded soldiers. You came for us when everyone else abandoned the sector." His voice grew stronger with each word. "You wore no insignia, but we all knew, Ghost Wing." Irena's face remained impassive, but her knuckles whitened. "You need rest. 3 days we were pinned down. You led 7 operatives through sniper territory. I took a bullet in the shoulder, and you carried me the last kilometer yourself." He reached for her arm. "You saved my life, all our lives." Mirella appeared in the doorway, overhearing enough to stop her in her tracks. The young nurse's eyes darted between them, another piece of the puzzle falling into place. By evening, Captain Petrescu's account had spread through the center like wildfire. Not just an orderly, a commander. Not just Ghost Wing, its leader in the field. Veterans who had previously ignored Irena now watched her with newfound respect, while administrative staff grew visibly uncomfortable. Colonel Solenko returned unexpectedly, ostensibly to check on the new patient. In the corridor, he cornered Irena. "Petrescu talks too much," he murmured. "The tribunal has been notified." "Then let them come," she replied, speaking more words at once than many had heard from her in months. That night, Irena found a folded note under her door. Inside was a tribunal summons, the date circled in red. Below it, someone had written, "They're coming to finish what they started." The center's fragile peace had shattered. Irena's true identity, the commander who had defied orders to save lives, was no longer a whispered rumor, but a spoken truth. And for those who had buried Ghost Wing's legacy, that truth was dangerous enough to warrant elimination. The tribunal convened in the center's largest meeting room, hastily converted with a long table at the front where 3 stone-faced officials sat beneath Romania's flag. Irena Mavros stood alone before them, her posture military straight despite her civilian clothes. The room buzzed with whispers from staff members crowded along the walls. "This hearing will examine operational irregularities at this facility," announced the lead official, a thin woman with glasses that caught the light whenever she looked down at her papers. "Ms. Mavros, explain your relationship with patient 17. Irena's silence stretched uncomfortably. She had maintained her vow for 23 years, speaking only when absolutely necessary. Now, surrounded by people hungry for her words, she felt the weight of every unspoken truth. Director Pavel Dragomir shifted nervously in his seat at the side of the room. The director had been instructed to remain silent during proceedings, but his eyes never left Irena's face. Their shared history hung between them like smoke. "The tribunal notes your refusal to cooperate," the official continued, marking something on her notepad. "We have reports of unauthorized treatment protocols, coded communications, and inappropriate relationships with patients." Colonel Andrei Solenko entered quietly through the back door, positioning himself against the wall. His presence was unexpected. Military officers rarely attended civilian tribunals. When Irena glanced his way, he gave an almost imperceptible nod. Mirla stood near the door, clutching a medical clipboard so tightly her knuckles whitened. The young nurse had been warned to stay away, but her loyalty to Irena outweighed any threat to her career. "This center will undergo immediate restructuring," announced the second official, a balding man with a perpetual frown. "Certain patients will be transferred to more appropriate facilities." The room erupted in murmurs. Everyone knew what more appropriate facilities meant: warehousing the difficult cases, separating the veterans who had formed healing bonds, dismantling the community they'd built. Captain Luca Petrescu, still recovering from his recent admission, shouted from the back, "She saved us both then and now!" The officials called for order, threatening to clear the room. Irena's fingers traced the outline of her hidden tattoo through her sleeve. For decades, silence had been her shield and her prison. Now it threatened everything she had sworn to protect. The lead official leaned forward. Miss Mavros, this tribunal recommends your immediate removal from this facility and a full investigation into your background. Irena looked up, meeting the woman's gaze directly. For the first time in 23 years, she considered that some truths demanded to be spoken. Some silences were more dangerous than words. The fate of every person in the room, every Ghost Wing survivor hidden among the patients, hung on what she would do next. Morella paused at the doorway of the supply room, watching Irena Mavros fold linens with methodical precision. Each crease, each fold followed a pattern that seemed oddly familiar. The young nurse had noticed it before, but dismissed it as mere fastidiousness. Today, something clicked. "Those aren't just hospital folds," she whispered, stepping closer. Irena's hands froze momentarily before continuing their work. The older woman said nothing, but her shoulders tensed slightly. "They're formations, aren't they? Like battle plans." The orderly remained silent, but her eyes betrayed recognition. Mirela had spent nights researching military tactics after finding the medal. These weren't random patterns. They were encrypted Ghost Wing formations, folded into everyday objects. Messages hidden in plain sight. "Who are you signaling?" Mirela asked, her voice barely audible. Irena finally looked up. Not signaling, remembering. She smoothed the sheet with weathered hands. "Some habits never leave you." In the East Wing, a commotion erupted. The nonverbal veteran had begun frantically drawing his chalk symbols across the floor, larger than ever before. When Mirela and Irena arrived, Director Dragomir was already there, his face ashen. "His medical records arrived," the director said, handing Irena a file. "His real ones." Irena opened the folder, her expression unchanging even as her fingers trembled slightly. The veteran looked up, his eyes finding hers with unexpected clarity. "Sergeant Victor Ionescu," she read aloud. "My spotter." The chalk drawing suddenly made terrible sense. Victor had been drawing the Ghost Wing emblem not as random fixation, but as recognition. He'd been trying to communicate with her all along. "The extraction in Pristina," Dragomir said quietly. "The shelling that caused his brain damage." Morella watched as Irena knelt beside Victor. The sergeant reached out, touching her arm exactly where the tattoo was hidden beneath her sleeve. A perfect memory in a damaged mind. "I thought you were dead," Irena whispered. "They told me no survivors." Victor's eyes welled with tears as he sketched something new. A crude map with 7 points marked in sequence. The same pattern Irena had been folding into linens for months. "He remembers the mission," Dragomir observed. The one I abandoned him on," Irena finished, her voice hollow. "I followed protocol and left him behind." Victor shook his head violently, drawing a circle around both their symbols. Morella understood first. "He's not blaming you. He's saying you both survived." The weight of 7 years of misplaced guilt visibly lifted from Irena's shoulders as she took Victor's chalk-covered hand in hers. The debt she had carried, the ghost that haunted her daily routine, suddenly transformed into something else. A responsibility to the living, not the dead. "It's not just a tattoo," Morella whispered, hunched over the faded military archives she'd smuggled into the supply room. "It's a death sentence." The young nurse had spent 3 sleepless nights piecing together fragments of classified information about Ghost Wing. Her fingers trembled as she traced the outline of the winged emblem in a redacted document, identical to the mark on Irena Mavros's arm. What struck her most wasn't what the papers contained, but what they deliberately omitted. "They've been erased," she explained to Director Pavel Dragomir, who stood with his back to the door, keeping watch. "After the unit was disbanded, every record was purged. The tattoo doesn't officially exist anymore." Pavel nodded grimly. "Those who still wear the ink are what we called unofficial ghosts. Soldiers who never existed on paper, but fought the bloodiest battles. His voice dropped. The government marked them for exile, some for permanent erasure. The revelation sent chills through Mirella's body. She understood now why Colonel Solenko's salute had caused such commotion. He hadn't just recognized a veteran, he'd acknowledged someone the state had tried to make disappear. Throughout the center, whispers traveled like wind through mountain pines. Veterans gathered in small groups, exchanging theories about Irina. Some claimed she had led extraction missions behind enemy lines. Others insisted she was the whistleblower who exposed war crimes that powerful people wanted buried. Is that why the funding threats keep coming? A physical therapist asked during an impromptu staff meeting in the laundry room. Because they want her gone? Mirella watched how the orderlies nodded knowingly. The center's fate had become inextricably tied to Irina's survival. If she was removed, the facility would likely be shuttered soon after, a convenient way to silence all witnesses at once. That evening, Mirella found the nonverbal veteran frantically drawing the winged emblem again, this time with arrows pointing to various parts of the rehabilitation center. The nurse studied his work, suddenly understanding. He wasn't just drawing from memory, he was mapping something. "They're here, aren't they?" she asked softly. More ghost wing survivors, hidden in plain sight. The man's eyes met hers, a flash of lucidity breaking through his usual vacant stare. He tapped his chalk against the floor 7 times. 7 survivors, including Irina. 7 people the government wanted forgotten. As darkness fell over the Carpathian facility, Mirella realized the rehabilitation center wasn't just a place of healing. It was a sanctuary for ghosts, and someone was determined to exorcise them all. Mirella's hands trembled as she clutched the aged photograph, her mother's living room suddenly feeling too small, too suffocating. Elena Mavros sat across from her, eyes downcast, fingers nervously twisting the edge of a worn tablecloth. "You told me she died in Kosovo," Mirella whispered, her voice cracking. "You showed me a grave, brought me there every year with flowers." Elena sighed, the weight of 2 decades of deception visible in the slump of her shoulders. "What would you have had me do? The government declared her dead. The ghost wing never existed officially. Those who survived were scattered, their identities erased. She's my aunt, my flesh and blood." Mirella slammed the photograph down. "I've been working alongside her for months, and neither of you said a word." The revelation crashed through Mirella's understanding of her own history. Irena Mavros, the quiet, enigmatic orderly who moved like a shadow through the rehabilitation center, was her mother's sister, the aunt whose heroic death story had shaped Mirella's decision to become a nurse. "She made me promise," Elena whispered. "After what happened in Sarajevo, after the tribunal first tried to silence them all, Irena said the safest thing for everyone was to remain dead." Mirella paced the small room, tears streaming down her face. "All those nights I told you about the mysterious woman at work, how she calmed patients no one else could reach. You knew. You knew it was her." The betrayal cut deep, but something else was taking root beneath Mirella's anger. Understanding. The pieces aligned. Irena's expertise, her silence, the way veterans responded to her presence. The metal hidden in the prosthetic, the scratched-out faces. 3 days later, as the tribunal's proceedings intensified, Mirella watched Colonel Solenko questioning Irina about unauthorized treatment protocols. Her aunt sat straight-backed, answering in monosyllables, giving nothing away. "The patient records show unorthodox intervention methods," Solenko pressed, though his eyes held a different message than his words. "Methods consistent with classified field operations." Mirella stepped forward before she could stop herself. "Those methods saved Vasile Dumitru from self-harm. I witnessed it personally." The tribunal members glared at the young nurse's interruption, but she continued, her voice growing stronger. I've documented every case where orderly Mavros intervened. Each resulted in significant improvement. That night, Mirella slipped into the supply room where Irina was organizing linens in those strange, deliberate patterns. "Why didn't you tell me?" Mirella asked softly. Irina's hands stilled. "Would it have been easier, knowing your aunt was a ghost, hunted by her own government?" Mirella took the folded sheet from Irina's hands. "I would have helped you sooner." Doru Vlasianu sat alone in his car outside the rehabilitation center, staring at the stack of documents illuminated by his dashboard light. His hands trembled as he flipped through the declassified military files he'd finally obtained through an old contact at the Defense Ministry. The truth about his father's disappearance wasn't what he'd expected. Ghost Wing wasn't disbanded because of failure, he whispered to himself. They were silenced. The documents revealed that Ghost Wing had uncovered systematic corruption within Allied forces, weapons trafficking, protection rackets, and civilian casualties deliberately misreported. Irina Mavros hadn't just been a field operative, she had been the whistleblower who tried to bring it all to light. The Ghost Wing tattoo that once symbolized elite status now marked her for exile, a permanent reminder of her choice to stand against corruption. The journalist's throat tightened. His father hadn't abandoned the family as he'd been told. He'd been one of Irina's closest allies in the exposure attempt, and had disappeared during the subsequent purge. Doru's lifelong anger dissolved into grief, then hardened into resolve. The next morning, he approached Irina as she folded linens in the supply room. She tensed at his presence, eyes darting toward the exit. "I know what you did," Doru said quietly, "and I know what happened to my father." The orderly's hands stilled, her expression unchanged, but something shifting behind her eyes. "They told us he deserted," Doru continued, "but he stood with you, didn't he, against what was happening?" Irina remained silent, but her gaze met his directly for the first time. "I came here to expose you," he admitted. "I thought you were part of the cover-up, but now I understand. You're the reason anyone remembers Ghost Wing at all." He placed a photograph on the table between them, his father standing beside a younger Irina, both in uniform. "The tribunal isn't about investigating irregularities," Doru said. "It's about erasing the last witnesses. The veterans here aren't just casualties of war, they're inconvenient memories." Irina's fingers brushed the photograph, the first voluntary movement she'd shown since he entered. "I want to help," he said firmly, "not just for my father, but for all of them, for the truth." The woman who had maintained her silence for decades looked at the journalist with newfound recognition. She nodded once, decisively. Outside, the mountain wind picked up, rattling the windows of the center. The storm that had been building since Colonel Solenko's inspection was about to break, but this time, Irina wouldn't face it alone. Pavel Dragomir stood at his office window, watching the tribunal members depart for their evening recess. When the door clicked shut behind him, he turned to face Irina Mavros with weary resignation. "You were never supposed to know I arranged your placement here," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "After all these years, I thought anonymity would protect you." Irina's eyes narrowed. The pieces were finally aligning. The way staff had been instructed to never question her background, how her personnel file remained suspiciously thin. "You were my commanding officer," she stated flatly. It wasn't a question. Pavel nodded, sinking into his chair. "Before they stripped my rank and buried me in this administrative hell." He gestured around his modest office. "All because I couldn't accept that I wouldn't share your bed." Irina finished coldly. "And now you expect gratitude for this, what, penance?" The director's face flushed with shame. "I deserved worse than demotion. But this placement, bringing you here, wasn't my idea alone." From his desk drawer, Pavel retrieved a sealed envelope, yellowed with age. Inside was a handwritten letter bearing the signature of General Constantin Vasilescu, a name Irina hadn't heard in 15 years. "The general orchestrated everything," Pavel explained. "He knew what was coming, the systematic dismantling of programs for veterans who knew too much. The cleaning out, as the ministry calls it." Irina scanned the letter. her hands trembling slightly. "He placed me here as a guardian." "Not just any guardian," Pavel said. "The last Ghost Wing commander. The only one they couldn't silence or buy off." He leaned forward. "Look around you, Irina. Half the patients here were under your command once. The nonverbal veteran drawing your emblem, your spotter from Sarajevo." The revelation hit her like physical pain. All this time, she'd been surrounded by her own people, wounded, broken, but alive. "The tribunal isn't about funding or protocols," Pavel continued. "They're here to finish what they started when they disbanded Ghost Wing. In 60 days, UN documents will be unsealed that could implicate dozens of officials in operations we carried out." Irina's jaw tightened. "So they need us gone before then. All of us. Every last ghost." Pavel's voice cracked. "I couldn't save you back then. I couldn't even save myself. But I could give you this, a chance to protect what remains of our unit." Outside, twilight settled over the Carpathian Mountains. In the distance, Irina could see Mirella walking with Doru across the grounds, two unlikely allies in a battle neither had chosen. "You should have told me sooner," Irina said finally. Pavel nodded. "I know, but some ghosts are harder to face than others." The tribunal's third day began with a chilling revelation. Mirella discovered a classified document left conspicuously in the supply room, minutes from a closed ministerial meeting that exposed the entire proceeding as a calculated purge. The tribunal wasn't about protocol violations. It was a desperate race against time. "They're trying to erase us before the United Nations unseals the Ghost Wing archives," Irena whispered to Director Dragomir, her usually stoic face betraying genuine fear. 60 days. That's all the time they have left before decades of operations become public record. Pavel nodded grimly. The rehabilitation center had never been about healing veterans. It had been a collection point, gathering the last living witnesses to operations that powerful people needed buried forever. His complicity in this scheme weighed heavily on his conscience. Outside the hearing room, Colonel Andrei Salenko approached Irena with unusual discretion. "We need to speak privately," he murmured, guiding her toward an empty corridor. Once alone, the military man's stern facade cracked. "My brother Nikolai was in Pristina during the extraction failure of '97, he revealed, voice barely audible. "You pulled him from the rubble when your own team had fallen." He described a woman with eyes like winter steel who carried him 3 kilometers with a bullet in her thigh. Irena's silence confirmed everything. The colonel slipped her a security key card. "The tribunal chairman has already drafted your transfer orders. They're planning to separate all Ghost Wing survivors by tomorrow." Throughout the center, staff members noticed unusual activity. Unmarked vehicles arriving, medical records being loaded into transport vans, sedatives being prepared in quantities that suggested forced relocations rather than treatment. Captain Luca Petrescu, still recovering from his wounds, organized the ambulatory veterans into watchful shifts. "They'll come at night," the captain warned. "They always do." Doru Vlasianu, no longer pretending to be an objective journalist, used his press credentials to document everything. His recorder captured damning conversations between tribunal officials discussing permanent solutions and memory management protocols. The pressure became suffocating. Mirella found herself followed between shifts. The nonverbal veteran grew increasingly agitated, his chalk drawings now depicting cages and scattered wings. Even the kitchen staff reported inventory checks for potential weapons. That evening, as darkness settled over the Carpathian facility, Irena gathered her closest allies in the supply room. "Tomorrow they'll separate us," she said, her voice finding strength in crisis. "Tonight we must decide. Continue hiding or finally stand together." The Ghost Wing tattoo on her arm seemed to pulse with renewed purpose as she looked at the faces around her. Not just colleagues anymore, but the last line of defense against a buried truth fighting to breathe. The tribunal chamber fell silent as Irena Mavros stepped forward, her weathered hands steady, despite the gravity of her decision. Decades of practiced restraint dissolved in an instant as she reached for the microphone, bypassing the stammering officials who had orchestrated this sham proceeding. "My name is Irena Mavros, former commander of Ghost Wing Special Operations," she announced, her voice carrying an authority that had lain dormant for years. "And I will no longer be silenced." The broadcast lights intensified as security personnel froze, uncertain whether to intervene. Director Dragomir watched from the back, a complex mixture of pride and fear crossing his face. This was the woman he had once served under, finally reclaiming her voice. "These are the names of those we abandoned," Irena continued, unfolding the hidden list she had meticulously maintained. One by one, she read aloud the forgotten veterans, each name resonating through the chamber and across the airwaves. The non-verbal veteran in his wheelchair nodded vigorously, tears streaming down his face as his former commander honored their fallen comrades. Morella stood transfixed near the door, witnessing her aunt's transformation from silent orderly to commanding presence. The young nurse had smuggled the broadcast equipment settings to Irena earlier that morning, a small act of defiance that now enabled this moment of truth. "Ghost Wing was disbanded not because we failed," Irena declared, "but because we refused to participate in the systematic erasure of evidence documenting war crimes." Her revelation sent ripples through the room as Colonel Solenko stepped forward, standing at attention beside her in silent support. Doru Vlaskianu, positioned strategically with his recording device, captured every word. The journalist's eyes glistened. Here, finally, was the truth about his father's disappearance, broadcast to the world. "This rehabilitation center houses the last survivors of an operation your governments have tried to erase," she continued, addressing not just the tribunal but the international audience beyond. "Your purge ends today." Within hours, the broadcast had gone viral. Phone lines at the center jammed with calls from international media, human rights organizations, and government officials scrambling to contain the fallout. The tribunal officials, exposed on live television, had no choice but to suspend proceedings indefinitely. By nightfall, United Nations representatives had arrived, establishing a protective presence around the facility. Veterans emerged from their rooms, many for the first time in days, gathering in the common area where Captain Petrescu led an impromptu toast to their vindication. In her quarters, Irena sat alone, the weight of 20 years of silence finally lifted from her shoulders. A soft knock announced Mirella's arrival, bearing tea and the quiet certainty that nothing would ever be the same. "Was it worth it?" the young nurse asked. Irena glanced at the Ghost Wing tattoo on her arm, no longer hidden. It always was. The winter snow had settled over the Carpathian Mountains when the official letter arrived, bearing the government seal and a promise that would change everything. The rehabilitation center would receive permanent funding, its future secured after months of uncertainty. Morella stood at the window of what was now her office, the director's nameplate freshly engraved with her name. 6 months had passed since Irena Mavros had broken her decades-long silence before the tribunal. The broadcast had sent shockwaves through military and political circles, forcing accountability where there had been only shadows. International pressure had mounted swiftly, with human rights organizations and veterans groups rallying to protect the center and its residents. "Are you comfortable in that chair yet?" Irena asked from the doorway, her voice still carrying the slight rasp of someone unaccustomed to regular speech. Mirella turned with a smile. "I'm learning." Director Dragomir left surprisingly detailed notes. "Pavel always was thorough, even when he was trying to hide something," her aunt replied, a hint of forgiveness softening her features. The rehabilitation center hummed with renewed purpose. Captain Petrescu had become a volunteer counselor, his experiences in Sarajevo now a source of strength rather than shame. Colonel Solenko visited monthly. bringing resources and quiet apologies for years of institutional neglect. Even Doru Vlasianu had found peace, publishing a book about Ghost Wing that honored both the living and the dead, including his father. Twice weekly, Irena taught trauma care in the East Wing. Her students, nurses, paramedics, and volunteers, watched in reverent silence as her weathered hands demonstrated techniques that had saved countless lives on forgotten battlefields. No longer hidden, the Ghost Wing tattoo on her arm had become a symbol of resilience rather than secrecy. The nonverbal veteran drew something new today, Mirella said, handing her aunt a folded paper. Irena opened it to find not the obsessive wing emblem, but a simple sunrise over mountains. Progress after all this time. In the evenings, Irena would walk the perimeter of the center, not as sentinel, but as guardian. The threatening notes had stopped, the tribunal members reassigned to distant posts. The veterans greeted her with quiet nods or salutes, acknowledgments of a shared history now honored rather than erased. "We're planning a memorial garden," Mirella said as they walked together one evening, "for those who never made it home." Irena nodded, snow crunching beneath her boots. "Names carved in stone," she said. "No more scratched-out faces." Her silence had been transformed into strength for those who followed, not through grand speeches or ceremonies, but through the quiet persistence of truth, finally allowed to breathe in the mountain air.